Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are tackling a big one, the case for free trade. We're diving into the core arguments from the classic book, Free to Choose, to really understand why this idea is so powerful and, still so controversial.
So here's our game plan for today. We're going to start with a really simple idea from Adam Smith. Then we'll get into busting some common myths about protectionism. After that, we'll check out the historical evidence, see how all this ties into personal freedom, and then we'll wrap up with a pretty bold challenge that the source material throws down. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Adam Smith's common sense. To really get the argument for free trade, you have to go all the way back to the beginning, to this foundational idea that's over 200 years old, but, as the source argues, is just as relevant today. The entire case pretty much boils down to this one simple piece of logic from Adam Smith. I mean, think about it. If it makes sense for your family to buy stuff from the cheapest store, why wouldn't it make sense for an entire country to buy things from whoever sells it cheapest, whether they're down the street or across the globe? The text just calls this common sense. Okay, but that brings up a huge question. If it's really that simple, why is free trade so controversial? Well, Adam Smith actually had an answer for that. He pointed his finger at what he called the interested sophistry of producers, which is a fancy way of saying powerful groups who actually benefit from trade restrictions, even if it hurts everybody else. Today, we just call them special interests. So that brings us right to Section 2, the myths of protectionism. This is where the source really starts to deconstruct the most common arguments you hear for putting up trade barriers, what economists call protectionism. And what's so fascinating here is how the text completely flips our usual way of thinking on its head. First, it says, look, jobs just for the sake of having jobs, that's pointless. What we really want are productive jobs. And then, even crazier, it says exports are not the prize. No, the real gain from trade is all the cool stuff we get to import. The exports, that's just the price we have to pay to get those imports.
Now for the big one, the argument you hear all the time, that we have to protect high-wage domestic jobs from so-called unfair low-wage foreign competition. The source claims this is a total fallacy, and the reason comes down to exchange rates. The value of one currency versus another isn't just random. It's always adjusting based on things like productivity. So what looks like a high wage here and a low wage there might actually balance out once you factor everything in. It's just not an apples-to-apples comparison.
This all ties into a really core economic principle called comparative advantage. And it's a wild idea. It basically says that even if one country is better and more efficient at making everything, it still comes out ahead by focusing on the things it's most efficient at, and then trading for everything else. And the book gives this brilliant analogy to make it stick. Imagine a top lawyer who happens to type twice as fast as her secretary. Should she do her own typing? Of course not. Her time is way more valuable practicing law. The same exact logic, the source argues, applies to entire countries.
So what about so-called unfair competition, like when a foreign government subsidizes its products to make them cheaper? Well, the book's take on this is pretty radical. It says we should send them a thank you note. Why? Because their taxpayers are footing the bill to give our consumers a discount. The source even calls it a kind of reverse foreign aid.
Okay, so that's all the theory. But does any of this actually work in the real world? Well, that brings us to Section 3, the evidence from history. The book looks at different countries as sort of a giant natural experiment. The main exhibit here is the really stark contrast between Japan and India. The source points out that back in the 19th century, Japan opened its doors, embraced markets, and just saw this explosive growth. A century later, India did the total opposite. It went with central planning and protectionism, and the result, according to the text, was decades of economic stagnation.
And the source reinforces this with an even starker example: Germany after World War II. You had West Germany, which embraced free markets and created an economic miracle. And then you had East Germany, with its central planning, which led to scarcity and repression so bad that they literally had to build a wall to keep their own people from leaving.
Now we get to Section 4, competition and freedom. And this is where the argument gets much bigger than just economics. The source makes this powerful claim that the choice between free trade and protectionism isn't just about dollars and cents, it's about personal freedom itself. And to put a number on this, the text points out that government at all levels spends something like 40% of our national income. Think about that. That means a huge part of our country's resources are being allocated by political decisions, not by our own individual choices in the marketplace.
And this government control, it shows up everywhere. You need a license to be a plumber. You need permission to start a bank.
You need approval to run a railroad. The source argues that every single one of these rules is a small chip away at our economic freedom.
So what's the best way to fight against monopolies and make sure there's healthy competition? Well, the source makes a really bold claim. It says the single most powerful antitrust policy you could possibly have is to just get rid of all barriers to international trade. Let the whole world compete.
And here's where it gets really serious. The argument connects this economic control directly to our most basic rights. I mean, when the government holds the power to grant your business a license or not, does that create a chilling effect? The source argues, yes, absolutely. People become afraid to speak out, to criticize the government, and that is a direct threat to freedom of speech.
All of this brings us to our final section. And it's not really a summary or a conclusion. It's more of a direct and frankly a pretty radical challenge to how we think about trade policy.
The book argues that we shouldn't wait around for these complicated multi-year trade negotiations. Instead, it proposes something really bold. A country should just move to free trade all by itself, unilaterally. The logic is that the biggest benefits of free trade, like lower prices and more choices for consumers, are enjoyed by the country that opens its own borders, regardless of what anyone else is doing.
And that leaves us with this final provocative question. Is the principle of free trade so beneficial that a nation should just go for it alone, opening its own markets even if other countries keep theirs closed? The source material makes its case loud and clear and leaves us to think about whether that's a risk worth taking.